Thank you so much. So let's get going. Glen and Willie are joining us from the U.S. Glen, you're in San Francisco, somewhere in the Bay Area, I believe. Willie, you're calling in from Boston. Two of us, Mr. Suzuki, Kuni, and myself are in Tokyo. A very hot topic. This is a continuation, sort of, from the opening session. The current geopolitical situation, which has been on top of minds of everyone, and how does that impact your life as a business person, as a policy leader? This is going to be the topic of this session, in particular around supply chain, which, as you know, is one of the most important topics for many Japanese industries, as well as US industries here. We were just chatting before this session, and Glenn reminded us that he actually has been doing this for 40 years, so following these very important trade policy discussions for 40 years. So he has seen many developments around these policy discussions. So just to give you a little bit of background, Glenn will focus more on the US political debate around the trade issues that I discussed, especially in connection with the US and the Japanese government policies. And I will ask Willie to talk a little bit more about the US situation, in particular, how US business sector is dealing with the current political development here. And obviously, Kuni is, in a way, I said, you're representing the business world. Obviously, he is the voice of the very important and critical industry of semiconductor here. So from the business perspective, we will hear from him. So Glenn, let's get going with you. If you can just share your sort of overview of what you're seeing on the political debate in the US.
Well, thank you very much, Yumiko, and thank you to GLOBIS for inviting us to participate in this panel discussion on a very timely subject. As Yumiko mentioned, I'm based in Washington, D.C. I'm right now in Silicon Valley, but usually I'm based in Washington, D.C. at the Center for American Progress. I've been watching rather closely the discussions and debates about China and about so-called industrial policy in Washington. I was at USTR from 1985 to 1990, and in the midst of the US-Japan semiconductor negotiations, which I participated in, as well as discussions and negotiations on supercomputers and telecommunications and so forth. And therefore, watching developments over the last 40 years, it's been very interesting to see all the changes. And clearly, as we all know, since that time, Japan and the United States have declined in semiconductor production, and China, Taiwan, and South Korea have increased. And certainly over the last several years, I would say since the second Obama administration, there's been increasing concern in Washington about competition with China on many fronts, but I think increasingly on the economic and national economic security side. And clearly semiconductors is one of the key aspects of this competition. And so with the Biden administration taking office almost 2 years ago, there's been some serious efforts to ensure that the US and other allies have secure and reliable supply chain and semiconductors, and an increasing concern that there may be increasing overdependence on China, and also that certain advanced semiconductor technology or telecommunications technology may be diverted by China to the military use. So with that in mind, the CHIPS Act was passed last year, and bipartisan, very strong Republican and Democratic support for this. So I think that the attempt to ensure stable and reliable supply chains is laudable, but I think the implementation is very difficult, in part because it really requires close cooperation with the private sector and with allies. And in particular, I'm sure Willie will mention this later, but in order to make sure that the government funds that are allocated are not are spent in the most efficient way and with the least waste possible. And it requires people in the government who have industry experience and knowledge, and people in the private sector who have an understanding about and appreciation of government policy. And I think on both scores, I think we have some challenges. With regard to the US and Japan, I can say from firsthand experience that the situation has changed completely in the last 40 years, where it used to be the US and Japan were the main competitors in semiconductors. Now the US and Japan are cooperating along with South Korea and with Taiwan and the EU, in large part because of the competition felt from China. And so this has several aspects to it. One is the trade with China and to what extent the advanced semiconductors are supplied to China. Another has to do with Chinese investment in the United States and to what extent those should be limited, especially in the high-tech sector or military-related sector. A third has to do with the fact of the supply chain and cooperating with the private sector and the allies. And here I think the U.S. and Japan have up to now been largely in sync. I mean, there's been some time lag because I think it's required the Japanese government and the Japanese companies to fully appreciate and absorb the U.S. concern and to cooperate with regard to semiconductors as well as semiconductor equipment manufacturers. So far, I think the U.S. and Japan have been relatively close in cooperation. What I'm seeing, though, is that if to the extent that the U.S. administration is going to increase the scope of the restrictions, this is going to create increasing challenges with regard to the partners involved, including Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and EU, but also, especially with the private sector. And the private sector, I'm sure, Willie and the Intel representative will be able to talk in more detail. But just within the last few weeks, it's become quite clear in Washington that NVIDIA and Intel and Qualcomm have expressed some real concerns about the prospects of the administration increasing the scope of the restrictions on semiconductor sales to China, and a real concern that this could lead to hurting the U.S. semiconductor industry in terms of being able to sell products to China. And I think the administration's hope is to kind of restrict kind of a laser focus on the most advanced semiconductors and especially those that have military applications. But again, I think it requires people in the administration to fully understand the nature and scope and the technology involved, and it's not clear that that's the case. The Semiconductor Industry Association has just come out a few weeks ago with a public statement expressing concern about this. And so I anticipate over the next several months that there's going to be increasing intense discussions between the U.S. government and the American private sector, as well as the U.S. government and allies, about how better to implement these policies. The final thing I would say is that because of the U.S. presidential election coming up on November 5th of next year, I don't anticipate that U.S.-China relations will be improving in the next year. I think the Congress in particular is increasingly strict with regard to China. The Biden administration actually is trying to moderate things because they want to make sure that there's constant dialogue and prevent any kind of misunderstanding that could result in unanticipated actions. So I think we'll see some tension there between the administration and the Congress. But I think overall, the next year we'll see a continuation of the Biden administration's policy on semiconductors and supply chains. And depending on what happens with the election, the presidential election next year, if the Biden administration continues, I expect there will be considerable continuity. But if there is a change of administration, whether a Republican administration or someone other than Biden, who becomes president on the Democratic side, we could see some significant changes on these policies. So let me close my opening comments there. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I think there was an interesting comment about how increasingly difficult it has become for business world to deal with these changes, in particular trade restrictions. So that is a good segue for Willie to talk a little bit more about intersections between business and the government or government policies, particularly around trade restrictions. For example, the dual supply chain is now quickly emerging in some sectors. You know what that means in terms of business leaders, what they have to think about, what they have to deal with these situations. So, Willie, if you can just take it from here and just share with us your overview of the current situation, that'd be great.
Sure, and also thank you for the invitation to speak today. I appreciate it. So let me just start with a few comments on what I see businesses doing. Definitely, they are diversifying their supply chains. We see Southeast Asia is one of the principal beneficiaries, particularly Vietnam, Malaysia, also Thailand and Indonesia to some extent. We see movement towards India, of course, Mexico. We see, a huge amount of transborder trade increasing between Mexico and the U.S., although Mexico hasn't kind of realized as much as one would have expected. Vietnam, you can see some of the big movements just in terms of, if you look at the shipping traffic, for example, the amount of long sea traffic has exceeded short sea for the first time last year, right? So you see a lot of these changes in trade patterns as a result of this. Now, a lot of what you see going on, certainly with manufacturing in the U.S., has a lot to do with incentives, whether it be the Inflation Reduction Act, which isn't a very good name for it, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. I think these are short-term distortions. I think, looking at this trade statistics, we have a couple of other things going on. Like we see, a huge amount of excess capacity in the East Asia to North America trade lane, also in the East Asia to Europe trade lane. But, this has been exacerbated, for example, on ocean shipping by new capacity coming on stream, because during the pandemic, the ocean carriers ordered a lot of new container ships. And then also what we've seen, air cargo has really kind of collapsed recently because there's been a return of capacity in passenger belly cargo. Okay. And, there hasn't been, especially in the eastbound Trans-Pacific trade lane, there hasn't been this kind of peak season that everybody has been expected, And so I think what that points to is a couple of things that really happened during the pandemic, which is what's been the motivation for all this. I need to have a more resilient supply chain. Okay. First, there were true interruptions of supply because maybe some suppliers had a number of issues. We had a number of semiconductor fab fires, for example, right? So there were supplier issues, but there's also a tremendous demand surge that happened during the pandemic, and that's still working its way through all these trade networks. Okay, and so I look at a lot of people who looked at all these disruptions say we have to have a more resilient supply chain. People aren't factoring in that there were both of those things that were going on at the same time. Okay, now we have, partly as a result of that, these industrial policy responses, which now what I need to give you the disclaimer, because I sit on the two committees with the Department of Commerce. One is the Advisory Committee on Supply Chain Competitiveness, which is a more general committee. And then I also sit on the Industrial Advisory Committee, which specifically advises Commerce on the CHIPS Act. Okay, so anything I say with regard to either of these, that's my own view. It's not speaking for the committees. Okay, so we have a lot of these industrial policy responses, and as Glen said previously, they have bipartisan support, particularly the CHIPS Act. Okay, now one of the consequences of having that bipartisan support is people figured out that these acts were going to pass. Therefore, in exchange for their support, a lot of people put in a lot of things that were near and dear to their own narrow agenda, right? So what we end up is you end up with legislation. This is how the legislative process works in the U.S. You end up with legislation that has a lot of things tacked on and a lot of promises that were made, okay, which sometimes results in these strange conditions coming out, like, you have the president talking about, organized labor in some of these chip fabs, and that's kind of not how things typically have been. Okay, now stepping back and looking at all these things taken together, you could say my assessment would be a couple things. Okay, first, people haven't come to grips with increased cost yet, and there will be waste. As, for example, we know when you move manufacturing to Southeast Asia, a lot of your component supply is still going to come out of China, right? So, and we're seeing stuff being transshipped, but, you have more handling, you have more costs, okay? So there's going to be more costs. There may be oversupply. I think that's one of the big concerns. I think especially we see as a kind of response to policy initiatives and restrictions on Chinese export of tools to Chinese semiconductor makers. I think we're going to see a huge supply gut on mature nodes. Okay, that's already coming because we sort of forced Chinese manufacturers into that. Okay, so that's coming. Okay, I don't think people have really come to grips with how interdependent the world really is. Okay, what we did is over the last 30 years, when we had growth of, a relatively free trading environment, countries really became interdependent and intertwined in many, many small ways. What we find is people keep getting surprised by these new dependencies that, oh, we didn't know about that. And I often tell people that as soon as you get rid of one dependency, I'll find another one for you. Okay, so I think that's one of the things. Okay, and so I think The Economist just came out with an issue this week. Their cover was Homeland Economics, the cover story, and it was really talking about this whole thing. They were very skeptical about these things as well, because it's very hard for a government agency to replicate the free market in terms of getting all the right answers and producing the best solutions. So, sorry for the pessimism, but, as the previous speaker said, I think this is going to be very hard. So those are my opening comments. I'm sure I'll trigger a lot of questions with that.
Thank you for that, Willie. Well, I'd like to now hear from Kuni, who probably understands how interlinked, interdependent everything is, from a business perspective, as Willie said earlier. So can you share your thought with us, please?
Yes. First of all, just let me touch upon the special term which we have been using in the company for a while. That is siliconomy. Siliconomy is like a coined word, a combination of silicon and economy. Siliconomy. Recently, Pat Gelsinger, our CEO, and then our management team started to use this keyword. What it means? Silicon naturally represents semiconductors. Semiconductors becomes an essential part of economy. It is already, but it will become more essential part. That's what it means. By numbers, as example, digital connected device. Over the past 5 years, it grew already 4 times as for connected device. And then in the next 10 years, in the coming 10 years, it will grow in 15 times, 15. That generates semiconductors demand naturally. And of course, connected device is not only the area where we see the generation of demand. So like edge to cloud, let's say, infrastructures, telecommunication, autonomous driving, and AI. Those are the areas where we see a big demand of semiconductors, right? That's why we started to use this siliconomy. Without understanding silicon, we can't talk about the economy. That is what Pat strongly believes, and we believes. And then talking about rising, this tension, geopolitical tension here, as we already discussed. So naturally, at the Intel, we have been focusing on the development of resilient supply chain by ourselves with the, greater level of partners, greater number of partners. So resilient supply chain in Intel consists of two parts. One is decentralization of manufacturing in the more distributed locations, such as Ohio in US, and then Poland and Germany in Europe. Why we do this? Many of you know, semiconductors, 70% of semiconductors, or 60 or 70%, are manufactured in Asia today, as already everybody pointed out. So that's not good balance. So to make a well-balanced distribution, we have decided to invest a lot of money on US and Europe, and so that we can see like a balanced distribution of location in manufacturing. That is one. The second one is expanding. We are expanding foundry business. Foundry business. Intel, as you might know, we have been a very famous player as an integrated device manufacturers. We do vertical operation like R&D, design, and manufacturing as one vertical integration. But we have decided to enter the foundry services like what TSMC has been doing. So we like to make the industry healthier for the customer to have more choices of the products. They're having even other companies' IP, we are ready to manufacture. We are doing so already. So that's one of the important aspects, how we do the de-risking supply chains. So that's one. Then having said so, Government CHIPS Act in Europe, US, and Japan has encouraged us greatly for our multi-billion dollars investment up to now. So that's very important aspect of how we see how you see our investment. Then, that is a resilient supply chain at Intel. But then probably many of you might ask questions. How do you manage the cost? Yes, decentralization of manufacturing costs us more, to be straight, in general. So that's not easy one, right? Many places, many things we have to do, and we have many issues in resources and so on. Although, Intel has a robust, strong site selection team for the best possible selection of locations. So they do a very good job. But at the same time, as an industry, have to find the opportunity for the cost down in general. Because, again, the number here is, probably we have the area we can see cost down. That is post-production, back-end production. Back-end production includes assemble, test, and then also packaging. So Global South, 80% of this back-end production is happening inside of Global South. Okay, that's also another area where we see big gap in the cost, especially labor cost, because this production, back-end production, post-production requires very intensive human-centric labor. So that costs us a lot. It means, on the contrary, there is opportunity for us to make it cost down by shifting the gear to automation. So that's an area where we have to work on. Intel is not only one company with the key partners and the key competitors. All together, we have to work on it. So then we can see probably cost versus the de-risking kind of balance. So that's what Intel has been doing, and then Intel is thinking today. So that's all at my initial stage of statement.
No, thank you for that. My initial question was supposed to be how effective are these government policies, and you already, I think all of you said no, they're not very effective. So you answered a question before I asked. So I guess the question that I would like to pose here is, so what are the recommendations you would make with regard to these policies so that they can be more business friendly and also effective, but also at the same time reflecting the fact that U.S.-China relation does not seem to be improving, and also the political landscape, as Glen, you mentioned, it doesn't look like it's going to change anytime soon. So, just reflecting the reality of Washington as well as the China-U.S. relations, what are the realistic but also more effective trade policies that, Glen, for example, you would recommend from your seat?
Well, what Willie said, there are 3 points that I really very much endorse. I agree with most of what he said, but especially number 1 is unintended consequences. Number 2 is how interdependent we are. And number 3, distortions. And I think that the unintended consequences can be partly remedied if we have more input from the private sector. Because I think people in the government don't necessarily, unless they've had a lot of industry experience, can't really fully grasp the potential unintended consequences. So that issue, I think, can really be ameliorated by having more people, either industry input or people from the private sector who actually join the government and work. Number 2, this notion of people not fully understanding how interdependent we are, that is very true. The Biden administration, when it came into office, tried to impose certain Buy America provisions. But within a year or so, they realized they actually couldn't implement a lot of these because a lot of these products or components that they thought were available in the United States were no longer being made in the United States. And if we had people in the private sector who had more input, I think the administration would have learned earlier on the limitations of the policies that they proposed. And thirdly, with regard to distortions as well, I think if you have any kind of government engagement, and I was in the private sector for 22 years, so I can fully understand. Although I was in U.S. here for 5 years, I was in business for 22 years, so I can certainly appreciate the potential for distortions. And in general, it's true that the private sector and the market is more efficient in allocating resources. So, but in the case of China, I think even Eric Schmidt would agree that there is a role for government to play in the United States to ensure that the U.S. has a robust high-tech sector, including especially semiconductors and telecommunications. Here again, I think having greater input and interaction and perhaps personnel from the private sector in the government would alleviate. Now, the one thing is if you have too many people from the private sector in the government, then that can result in industry capturing the government to the detriment of the public welfare. So that has to be prevented. But there has to be a good balance between private sector knowledge and input and experience on the one hand and government policy. And I think at this point, the balance is much, much more strongly towards the government policy and not enough the private sector.
Willie, would you react to that? You are basically, a business voice, so to speak, on these committees that you're sitting on.
Yeah. Well, so I agree very much with what Glen said. Okay, now, first of all, I want to say, as far as policies, the recent policies being implemented, we won't know the outcomes of those for some number of years. We may not know for 10 years, although I suspect we'll know sooner than that. Okay, but these things have a long tail. It takes some time to play out. But as Glenn said, I spent 28 years in industry, and most of that time in industry was when the world was really globalizing from the late 90s until through the 2010, well, the 80s and 90s and 2010s is when I spent in industry. So, the last decade in industry I spent was really when people were moving production over to China from North America, from the United States, from Western Europe, and so on. Okay, but what Glenn said is right. And by the way, that's one of the reasons I sit on these committees, because when you look at politicians, and in particular career civil servants, it doesn't matter whether they're in the U.S. or if they're in the European Union or whatever. It's like they're career civil servants, which means they spent their whole careers doing that. They don't really know how supply chains work. They don't really know how manufacturing works. They don't really know how any of this stuff works. And that's why one of the things, I wrote a piece in Harvard Business Review that just came out in the September-October issue, which says, people in business have to educate public officials because they don't know, right? And so we have to do the best job we can educating, and we have to do it in a balanced way, because I completely agree with Glenn. A lot of, and especially in the U.S., policies are designed to avoid that type of capture, and as a consequence, it becomes very hard to negotiate within what are called FACA laws, Federal Advisory Committee laws, and stuff like that. Okay, but I would also say I think the core problem. Okay, I joke with people. I was never a fan of industrial policy, and now I'm working on it. Okay, but the core problem is we've had a situation in the world where you have some countries who heavily subsidize some industries. Okay, so they have industrial policies, and by the way, when you look at Made in China 2025, when you look at some of these other policies, they are very wasteful. Okay. However, I would argue they don't care, right? Because these industries are strategic for them, and so they're going to get capabilities any way they can, and that goes all the way back to the 863 program in China from March of 1986. Okay, so they've been on that for a long time. Okay, and now the U.S. and Japan and Western countries in general are faced with, how do we deal with that, right? Because there are a lot of industrial capabilities, because of subsidies, a lot of countries have just lost those capabilities entirely. Okay, and that's probably not an acceptable outcome. So it's a very hard question.
Thank you. So from the Intel's perspective, it sounds like there are some positive developments. Like, for example, the current situation is really encouraged in a way in terms of digitization and automation, because of the fact that you have to deal with this political risk, these risks. But again, in your opinion, what are the effective industry policies or government policies that you would like to see that you haven't seen as yet?
I don't know. I can answer to your question in the right manner, but just reminding what Glen said at the initial statement. So today, Intel, Qualcomm, and NVIDIA, showing the just kind of official concerns on this more restriction of export, more restriction of trade. So that's what we see, the situation of today. While we, as suppliers, invest a lot of money with government under CHIPS Act, export restriction, trade restriction will squeeze the demand, right? So squeezing demand cannot justify big investment on supply. So that's kind of contradicted circle. So of course government knows it and the private sector knows it, but as far as Glen already pointed out, so recently, again, those three companies, US companies, showed official concern to the government. That is a whole picture of today. So that's all about it.
Great, thank you. I actually would like to take questions from the audience because I'm sure a lot of people are eager to ask questions. If you don't mind, I guess raise your hands. Is that what we're going to ask? Okay, and keep your question relatively short. That would be great. Yes.
Good morning. Ohayou gozaimasu. Yeah, I think it's very helpful to see Intel's new investment and the CHIPS Act driving expansion of new production, which is desperately needed geographically. We have one advanced chip that is 94% produced in Taiwan, and that has huge geostrategic implications. So it'll take a while to diversify from that, knowing the new plants going up in Arizona and elsewhere. I just wanted to have a comment on that, the geopolitical impact of 94% of advanced chips coming out of Taiwan and the current political situation.
That was supposed to be my next question, but I'm glad you asked. You know, China, Taiwan, obviously not easy to diversify their supply chain. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, very difficult ones. We cannot have kind of, what do you call, one size fit all solution is not available here. And then you talked about one important, the point. 94% of production is there in the Taiwan for particular device and so on. So on the contrary, Japan, as you know, we have many key suppliers for the equipment and the tools and the materials and so on. Photoresist is one of the very important ones. 80% of total production is managed by Japanese company. That's on the opposite side. So that is typical kind of fundamental difficult ones for this discussion. That's again my just statement as of now.
Willie, would you comment on that question with regard to how easy, how difficult? You said it's just impossible, basically, when there's so many different elements just sort of interlinked, interdependent each other in a supply chain. Just moving one facility to one country from another would not sort out this problem. So if you have any thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think he's right that, we have a high dependency on Taiwan for foundry capacity and advanced processes. I always remind people that TSMC built that capacity by investing, in some cases, 40 billion, 30 billion plus a year for the last 3.5 decades. Okay, and they built that capacity for a long time. And I also remind people that for a long time, they were doing it because American companies in particular didn't want to do it. They said, I don't want to invest that kind of capital. Don't want to take that type of risk. I don't want to have to do, I don't have to, worry about getting economically viable yields and so on. And if they want to do it, let them do it. Okay, because we didn't think it was going to be important. So I think it's important to remember all that from the 1990s and the 2000s when everybody did that. Now, I think the wake-up call has been Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Okay, people don't really want to talk about it that much, but there are numerous examples, of Russia's invasion of Ukraine that people weren't paying attention to. Like, for example, what percentage of the aerospace titanium were Boeing and Airbus getting from Russia? Airbus continues to get aerospace titanium from Russia because they don't have any alternatives. Okay, now, so I mean, obviously that's what people were worried about. Okay, but can it be moved? Sure, it can be moved. Can it be, can we have multiple sources? Sure, it can, but don't think it's going to happen overnight, and it's hard work. Okay, we hear Morris Chang complaining about that all the time, but it's going to take time. But that's the core issue. What happens in the face of this geopolitical uncertainty? I also want to come back to this other question about trade restrictions. Okay, which was, yes, I hear that Intel and NVIDIA and Qualcomm say we need to have more sales, right? I point people to the example of what happened to GPS. When you restrict the sales of it, then what you do is you force others to develop that capability. We see that with the new Huawei phone, where they've essentially used SMIC's 7-nanometer process and maybe 50% yield, but what we're doing is we're forcing them to build that capability, right? So I mean, these things aren't as simple as people would like to think.
And Glenn, you've been watching the space for the last 40 years or so, so you probably have a few words to share with us here. But it's true that not much attention was being paid in terms of Ukraine-Russia situation before it occurred. But I think things are quite different for China, Taiwan. I think quite a lot of people are paying quite a bit of attention here in terms of the potential risk scenario. Glenn, if you would like to share your thought.
Well, even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, being in Washington, D.C., I would say that from probably the third year of the Trump administration, there's been increasing discussion and debate in Washington about Taiwan and the potential for China taking action of some sort towards Taiwan. So, every week there's at least 2 or 3 or 4 seminars and discussions about Taiwan. And obviously with the invasion of Ukraine, it's been even more magnified and amplified. And certainly in Japan, I know that the invasion of Ukraine is immediately brought to the top of the discussion, this issue of Taiwan. My own assessment, being in Washington and talking actually with many experts who've visited Taiwan recently, and Willie, you may have a different view, is that I think the general view is that if things go the way they are now, it's unlikely that China is going to take some kind of a military action towards Taiwan, and that it is in China's interest to take a long-term perspective, and that therefore this issue of the geopolitical risk is not that acute. However, there is always the possibility of some kind of a unintended event, and that's precisely why I think the Biden administration is trying to cool things down and trying to, especially since the Congress is so active on China, to cool things down and to ensure that there is dialogue and discussion and there's no misunderstanding, because I think clearly the Biden administration wants to make sure, and especially with Ukraine going on now with Israel and the Middle East, I mean, the last thing they need is a conflict in East Asia.
Great, thank you. Another question? Please go ahead.
Thank you. I want to ask the panel whether the recalibration or reconfiguration of supply chain that's happening right now is a fundamental cause of a longer-term inflationary spiral. I mean, we won't know that until we get there, and there's a complete disconnect between the central bankers who are looking domestically at inflation versus the globalized world. That's my question.
Willie, would you take that?
Well, I think you're right. I think when you replicate parts of the supply chains, I mean, if you look at what's happened over the last, since the late 1990s, when we really went to a globalized world, it was really focused on economic efficiency. It was focused on getting costs down. Okay, and that meant leveraging scale advantages and so on. Right now, oftentimes that meant going to China for a lot of things. Okay, and as you move things to other locations and duplicate them, you're going to lose those scale efficiencies. Things are going to cost more. I think right now they are already costing more, but it's kind of masked by inflation. So it's like, I don't know how much that's contributing to inflation, but I believe it is. Now, the real thing you have to worry about is like a wage price spiral. I look at what's going on in the US right now. I think people are concerned about it. I think there's very real possibility, especially when you see some of these industries in transition, okay, which, you bring battery manufacturing to the US and then you look at how far down the learning curve CATL and BYD are, it's going to cost more, right? And I don't think people have come to grips with it yet.
Well, maybe at Intel, you said, Kuni, you are trying to reduce cost base by automating as much as possible. But would that be enough, or are you still seeing pressures in terms of rising costs because of the, I guess, new supply chain or diversified supply chain that you are trying to rebuild?
It's a really difficult questions, but I think your question is really right one. And then I personally believe inflation comes out. I can't see from my position, even Pat's position, we cannot see total kind of investment today. What is the cash flows, around the world? Of course, somebody is chasing those, but at the same time, as far as we see our own investment, like $100 billion in the coming 10 years. That is a direction of what Intel set already. It's a huge investment. That's good for macroeconomics wise, if that's effective. But if the investment is coming from all the key players and then all the government is helping those, I don't know the real pure macro pictures on it. So I personally also am afraid of these inflations in the coming years.
Glenn, I'm curious what you're hearing on the Hill in terms of how inflation may be linked to all these activities by companies who have been trying to diversify their supply chain and bring back some of the facilities from other countries to the U.S. It's kind of ironic. The Inflation Reduction Act is supposed to really reduce inflation, but I'm not sure if that's entirely working. So if you are hearing any thought, any discussions around this risk factor on the Hill, it would be interesting to hear.
Well, this issue of inflation, as you might imagine, is also affected by the political divisions in Washington, and I think that Democrats tend to argue that things are going in the right direction, that we're going to have a soft landing, that the economy is not going towards a recession. The Republicans are critical of the Biden administration and are both on domestic and international policy on a number of fronts, but Republicans tend to criticize the administration for a number of economic problems, including inflation. Again, I come back to this point that I was making before about the need for policymakers in Washington to be people who have had experience or have input from the private sector, because I do think that central bankers also need to be people who are watching very closely what's going on in the global economy and what impact that has on domestic economies. And I think that sometimes the central bankers are people who are maybe not as attuned to what's going on globally as they should be. But again, I think I really perceive, at least in Washington, the need for there to be either more discussion between the private sector and the policymakers, and I include not only the administration and the central banks, but also the Congress, and also the fact that in the United States, part of the problem, among many problems, I think in the United States, is when it comes to these issues that involve high tech and a lot of Silicon Valley related activities, the geographic distance between Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C. is just huge. And I go back and forth every year between Silicon Valley and Washington. I just find the outlook, the philosophy is just so different. And the knowledge and the outlook, the two sides really need to talk a lot more and educate each other more, because I think it's really, I find that it's really a bit dangerous that we have people in the administration and in the Congress who don't fully understand the technology and the need to regulate or, if necessary, impose restrictions, but on ways that are not going to stifle innovation and competition and reduce waste and distortion, And at the same time, I don't think that many people in Silicon Valley fully understand the national security or appreciate the national security implications of what the administration and the Congress are concerned about.
Thank you. Another question. Can we just take a question from a gentleman in the back? Oh, okay. We'll take another one. Okay.
I'd like to ask to the panel about the food supply chain issue because I'm from the food and agriculture sector. Do you think the solutions to the food supply chain issue is different from the ones to the semiconductor, or if different, how different?
Glenn, do you have any thoughts around that?
I didn't hear I didn't understand.
So his question is food supply. How is that different from the semiconductor supply chain issue that we're discussing? Are there common challenges, or do we think about it in a complete different context?
Between semiconductors and what?
Food.
Food. Oh, food. Well, I think there are
Agriculture products, I should say.
Okay, I understand. Well, I mean, I think there are a lot of differences. One is that, in semiconductors, obviously, there's levels of technology that are, quite different. I mean, from the memory chips to the most advanced microchips. But also, I think that, clearly there are similarities, but I think that the level of knowledge and sophistication necessary to deal with the semiconductor supply chain issue is considerably more specialized, requires specialized knowledge than in dealing with agricultural issues, I think. I mean, agriculture itself can be complicated, but I mean, it's a matter of, what components of agriculture, whether it's finished products or raw materials, and what type of, whether it's wheat or whether it's fish or meat or whatever. But clearly, I mean, the semiconductor issue is just so much more complicated and complex and requires technical expertise.
Thank you. Can we take the question from, yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Fuku Liu from Taiwan. I'm a professor at National University in Taiwan. I think this panel is great. Most of the information shared by panelists are much better than officials and politicians. My question quickly to you as geopolitics is now overshadow real industrial development, how exactly it might lead to the future. So where is the end? Because the world is now divided into a seriously two part, whether this geopolitics can be overcome. So my question, I hope our panelists can catch up. Thank you very much.
That's a hard one. Where is it going to end? How is it going to end? All right, so this is a hard one, but Willie, can you try to answer that? Your best prediction, how is it going to end?
My best prediction is a lot of these industrial policy experiments that we see are going to end up wasting a lot of money. Okay, and then people will get tired of it. Okay, but that's intimately tied with the geopolitical calculus. All right, so it's pretty complicated. I think we're going to see more bifurcation or diversification of supplies. We're going to see more replication. We're going to see higher costs as a consequence of that. The world will be less rich as a consequence of that. Okay, and I think that'll be kind of the price of this. Okay, but like I say, one of the reasons I volunteer to work on these committees is I'm trying to educate and try to prevent as much bad choices as possible, right? And it's like the market is a very efficient way of allocating resources. Okay, and the normal complaint about a lot of these policy things is, you think you're going to be smarter than the market, and that has been proven wrong over and over and over again. Nonetheless, there have been some significant successes over the years. Okay, so we have to work together with governments. We have to try to help them make better choices.
Okay, so Kuni, what's your best prediction? How is it going to end?
Sorry.
Where is it going to go?
I don't answer to it. Just I want to ask a question back to Professor National Taiwan University, Mr. Hu. Changing. So what you predict the next election in Taiwan?
Oh, that's a very good question.
Yeah, that's a
Yes.
question.
If you don't mind just making a very quick comment.
Actually, later in the panel, this is another point we will elaborate more. So since the time is too short, and I think I will encourage everyone to stay on for the next session. Thank you very much.
Okay, that's a very good way to get a lot of audience for next session. Glenn, do you want to just take that question just very quickly? What's your prediction? How is it going to end? Where is it going to go?
Well, my prediction is that we're going to continue to see competition, tension between the United States and China, United States and Russia. And I think, Iran and North Korea will also continue to be problems with the United States. Now, I think one of the areas that I think Japan can play an important role is that the current Biden administration and perhaps the Republican administration, it tends to look at the world in black and white terms. I think in the case of Biden administration, it's democracy versus autocracy. During the Bush administration, it was the axis of evil. And I think, during the Cold War, you could understand that the U.S. would try to divide the world that way. But right now, over the last 20 years, the world has become so complicated, and as Willie mentioned, so interdependent. I think there's a real limitation on that division. And I think that one of the things that Japan has been making a contribution, especially now with the G7 summit in Hiroshima and going forward, is I think Japan can play a very positive and constructive role with regard to countries like India and Brazil and Indonesia and South Africa and these other countries that are less likely to embrace one or the other. And I think that's a very, very important role that Japan can play, both in terms of national security and economics. And so I certainly hope that will help to ameliorate the intensity of the frictions and tensions.
Great, thank you so much. And we are almost out of time and need to wrap this up now. And thank you so much for a great session. Let's hope we will not be wasting too much money and we will not end up with less money in this world. And let's hope that, as Glenn, you said, hope that Japan is going to play or continue to play an important role to address this very, very important issue and a challenge that we all face. So again, thank you so much for your contribution and discussion. And again, thank you for the audience for being here. Thank you.